I'm going to go on to problem 32 now, but just before that, I just remembered the one thing I wanted to say, both about 23 and 24. One of the most subtle concepts, I think, in this chapter is the idea of a confounding variable, and that actually interacts very well with this discussion of blinding here. One way to say that you should do the randomization after serving the party, so instead of before, is that if you do the randomization before, you're introducing a confounding variable, which is that associated with whether you're giving the candy or not is the knowledge. The waiter has the knowledge, or in this case, the waitress down here has the knowledge whether they're giving candy or not. And that could easily have an influence on how good the service is, what's the interaction like, and therefore an impact on how much they tip. So one purpose of blinding, especially in these two experiments, is to try to remove that possible confounding variable. So remember, a confounding variable is something that you're changing. Let's look in this case with the waitress. She's got a factor that she changes from one scenario to another, from one treatment to another, and that is supposed to be simply what kind of candy is given. That's supposed to be the only thing that changes between those scenarios, those treatments. And if she knows what's going to happen, then there's really another variable that's changing between the treatments that you don't want to change, namely what she's planning to do and her knowledge of that, and that could easily influence her behavior. So one of the big purposes of the single blinding on the experimental subject side is to try to take away some of those confounding variables. Okay, now antacids, that's going to give us another good example of a confounding variable in a minute. So we're comparing performance of three types of antacid. Because men and women may react differently, the subjects are split into two groups by gender right at the start. Then subjects are randomly assigned to take one of the antacids or to take a sugar pill made to look the same. And then subjects will rate their level of discomfort 30 minutes after eating. Okay, so a few questions. What kind of design is this? I picked this one because it's a good example of, it's a randomized experiment. Okay, and it's controlled. It's got the usual structure, and it's blocked by gender. Okay, so blocking, remember, is like stratifying for a survey. We are separating them out into two groups right at the start and then keeping them separate. It's almost like running just two separate experiments. It basically is running two separate but very, very similar experiments. That we know, we have this expectation that men and women may react differently, and we care about the difference. It's not that that's an annoyance that we want to use randomization to try to ignore. We actually do want to know, okay, what's the result for men, what's the result for women? So the question is, why wouldn't you always do this? Why wouldn't you always block by all kinds of different variables? Well, the trouble is, suppose you had not a big number of people volunteering for this survey, say like just 50 people. As soon as you start blocking, maybe it's 25 men, 25 women, then you've got essentially two separate experiments with a smaller sample size. And the smaller the sample size, the harder it is to make sure your results are statistically significant. Just as a comparison, like back in 23, for example, this could have been blocked. The dining parties could have been blocked by are they ordering a large meal with paying lots of money, or a small meal? Maybe you could say parties that are paying over $50 and parties paying under $50. It might be interesting to know, are the big spenders more or less affected by getting candy? Hard to say, and certainly impossible to say given that blocking was not done here. But 92 is not the world's most huge sample size. We might not want to do that blocking because it would reduce the sample size in each of the blocks. Okay, so here, blocking by gender is very, very common because we realize nowadays that that's going to be an effect. I must say, with medical research, say 50 years ago, it's very common that these studies would have just been done on men, or that they would have been done on men and women and not have any idea that they might have actually react differently in a systematic way that would be of interest. Okay, so that's kind of a recent thing. Okay. One thing they ask is, this experiment uses volunteers versus trying to take a pure random sample of all people suffering from acid reflux. So remember, taking a random sample, that's something that happens with surveying, and we really want to do that. So it has an A in it. So is this really a bad thing? Okay. It seems like, oh, wait a minute, I thought we were supposed to take a random sample. Well, so the main thing is don't confuse surveys with experiments. Okay. The way the book responds to this is that they kind of say don't worry at all, and I want to say something a little different about that, but almost all experiments use volunteers, often for ethical grounds and often just for convenience. Okay, and that's okay because we're not trying to determine something like what's the incidence of acid reflux in the population. We're not trying to determine a population parameter, is using the technical language. Okay, we're not trying to determine some unknown number about a population. We're looking at the effect of different treatments and comparing. Okay, so for the most part, that's okay. I should mention, I think there is something that you can still worry about here. There could be a concern that people who volunteer for a study might systematically respond differently than the rest of the population. So I think the book is right to emphasize that you just don't want to invalidate all studies like this. Then you could just never get anything done. Okay, but I just want to mention it is possible that there could be an issue in generalizing the results, since people who volunteer for the study, may respond differently in a systematic way. Okay. So maybe here's a specific example. Maybe if they've had acid reflux for 5 years, and they don't respond to a study, it might be because they've tried a lot of treatments and nothing seems to make a difference. Whereas if they do respond to a study, it may be because I've seen some differences. I think the medications are effective, but I'm interested in helping them figure out what's the most effective. So there could be some issue there, but I don't want to overemphasize that and say, oh, it has to be a random sample of the people suffering from some condition. That's just not going to happen, practically speaking. Okay, here's another interesting one. How could the use of the placebo confound the experiment? We really want to use the placebo here because we'd like to compare them not just to each other, these three types of antacid, not just to each other, but to essentially doing nothing. And remember, you can't just make it doing nothing because then people will know whether they've taken a pill or not. Okay, so the first thing is the placebo is essential here as part of the control and the blinding. You don't want people to know, oh, well, they didn't give me any pill at all. Obviously, I didn't get an antacid. Okay. But it could confound simply because you're introducing something into their system. You're hoping that it should have very little effect, maybe just the psychological placebo effect that placebos always have, which is controversial exactly how strong that is. But with antacid, or with acid reflux specifically, just putting something into their stomach, even just a little pill, might actually make their stomach chemistry change and might have some sort of effect. Okay, so that's exactly a confounding variable that you'd like it to be just, are they getting the particular medicine or which kind of medicine or no medicine? But you're introducing another variable, which is, are they actually you'd like this to be no effect, but you're putting in the effect of, I'm particularly tongue-tied today, sorry. Am I putting anything into their system at all? And because there might be some small but measurable effect of just putting that sugar pill in to soothe their stomach perhaps, there is a little bit of confounding. I don't think it's a big worry, but it's a good example of this subtle issue of the idea of confounding. Okay.